Cristiano Ronaldo was going into his sophomore year at Miami, and he was finally the outright starter. They started off as the number 8 team in the country, but had to face an SEC opponent in LSU in week 1. Tyler Van Dyke was back for another season, and he was going to be the one to lead the Hurricanes as far as they were going to go this year. This Miami team was very talented, but they had a bunch of holes on both sides of the ball, including on the defensive front and on the receiving core. And all that meant was that Ronaldo was going to be involved in the passing game much more heavily than most running backs would be. But that was pretty much Ronaldo's role last season anyways. He was getting very few carries even when he did become the starter, but had just as many receiving yards as he did rushing yards. So when he struggled against a tough SEC front in LSU, it was no surprise. The Tigers finally took the lead at the end of the third quarter, and by the fourth quarter, Miami was throwing interceptions to end the game. This wasn't the start that Miami and Ronaldo had envisioned when they came into the season ranked in the top 10 with most of their returners back. But if there was a lesson to be learned from this game, it was that there's a lot of good football teams out there regardless of rankings, and Miami needs to quickly tighten up their play. This game has one of the most bullshit endings you're ever gonna watch, and you just gotta see it to believe it. Ronaldo would go and make a statement early. His efforts would go to waste that drive, but at least the Miami defense would make a hold here, forcing San Diego State to a field goal. But by the second quarter, Miami was down by a touchdown, and Ronaldo was still heavily involved in the passing game, and the only time he saw success in the running game is when they put him in at Wildcat. He was gassed after ripping this run down the sideline, and Miami would struggle as Ronaldo was on the bench catching his breath. Miami was down by 11 points by the time they got the ball back again just a few minutes later, and if they wanted to stay in this game, they needed to build some momentum before the half and get some more points up on the board, and preferably it was touchdowns rather than field goals. In the second half, Miami would do the unimaginable and hand the ball off to Ronaldo finally. I don't know, I'm not an expert, but it seemed like a pretty good decision to just get the ball in this guy's hands. Ronaldo would take them down the field and punch in this touchdown in the fourth quarter to take the lead, but San Diego State would force overtime, and this is where the bullshit ensues. The first overtime period was pretty routine. San Diego State would go down and score, and Miami would answer right back as Ronaldo would take this touchdown to the house. With the ball first in the second OT, Miami would look to Ronaldo in the air this time, and he would score again. We were in the third OT, and Ronaldo would force a fourth overtime with this two-pointer. Both teams would finally stop the opposing offenses and force a fifth overtime with field goals. But this is where we broke the game, because San Diego State would go for their two-pointer, but Miami would intercept it and take it all the way back for two of their own. But I guess the game couldn't register that because they gave San Diego State the ball back again. After losing the way they did last week to San Diego State, Miami was on a mission to beat a top 25 opponent in Pittsburgh. 0-2 was definitely insane, and Ronaldo was going to do everything in his power to try and put this team ahead. It looked like Tyler Van Dyke not only found his receiver on this play, but his stride as well. Miami was in complete control of this game, and all they had to do was run the clock out with Ronaldo. But for good measure, Ronaldo was going to take out his frustrations on Pittsburgh in the fourth. But Miami low-key needed this touchdown for the momentum against Nebraska, a very tough opponent in a very hostile environment. And even though Ronaldo was having a bunch of success in the first half, not only in the passing game, but in the running game as well, this game was still relatively low scoring by the second half. But unfortunately, this is where Ronaldo would get hurt, and he would miss the rest of the third and most of the fourth quarter. His first play back was at Wildcat in a one-possession game against Nebraska, and he absolutely turned up. The last time that I saw somebody run this hard away from somebody else was O.J. Simpson, and that wasn't on a football field. Nebraska had one final opportunity at the end of the game to try and win it, but it was just too much of a miracle, and it finally looked like Miami was back on track. That wasn't until Wake Forest smacked Ronaldo back into reality on the first drive of the game, and then when Miami had another opportunity in the red zone, Tyler Van Dyke would throw an interception. Wake Forest would take the lead in the third quarter with this sweep near the goal line, and they just weren't trying to give it back up. No matter what Miami did, Wake Forest would answer right back. Anytime they had a big play, Wake Forest had a bigger one, and anytime Miami scored, Wake Forest scored again. In the fourth, Wake Forest was still up by that touchdown, and Tyler Van Dyke would make a grave error pitching it back, and Wake Forest would scoop it for the game. With 3 losses through 5 games, Miami was embarrassed to be on the field. And even though Virginia was a bad team themselves, they were stuffing Ronaldo anytime that he got the ball. And of course his soft flopping ass got hurt in the first half, but would come back in the second half with a vengeance. He was making those Virginia defenders look silly out there, and at least it looked like Miami was going to pull another victory out against a terrible team. Miami would be 3-3 after this game. Definitely not something that they were proud of, but being 500 was a win at this point. And maybe if they could string together some wins, they would get into a pretty decent bowl game, and the season wouldn't be a complete complete failure. Ronaldo was getting abused in this game like an Asian kid came home with an A- on his report card. Miami's defense was doing a solid job against Florida State, so by the fourth quarter, it was still only a one-possession game, but Florida State would knock Ronaldo unconscious here, and by the time he woke up, the game was already over. After Miami suffered their fourth loss in 7 games, Ronaldo was contemplating if he should transfer in the offseason. It was clear that this team wasn't utilizing Ronaldo like he should be. He was barely getting carries, and the only time he was really touching the ball was in the open field when he was getting passes. That definitely played to Ronaldo's strengths, but he wanted 200 plus carries a season, something that he could do at a team like Georgia or Alabama. And even though Miami was up 28-3, Georgia Tech crawled back in this game and made it a one-possession game. And so Miami did what they always did during crunch time, and that was find Ronaldo in the passing game. He would be able to convert a couple of catches, and finally, a couple plays later, Tyler Van Dyke would take the read option and run it all the way for a touchdown. Miami would be able to win the game, and even though it wasn't statistically impossible, it was very unlikely they were going to play in the ACC championship or even get a good bowl game. But at least they were playing a terrible team next week. This was one of Ronaldo's best games of his career, and it makes sense that it came against a 1-7 Coastal Carolina team. My guy was looking like CMC out of the backfield. He was making the Coastal Carolina defenders look silly out there. This touchdown just before the half was huge, but it didn't matter because Ronaldo would absolutely take over in the second half. He would catch this one in the flat, and the Coastal defense was just too slow for Ronaldo and his blazing speed. That boy was running like he stole something. Coastal didn't learn their lesson because they would let Ronaldo catch the exact same pass in the fourth quarter. This time he would make guys look crazy out there. And after blowing Coastal out the water, their attention shifted to Duke, who had the same amount of losses as them. Ronaldo picked right back up where he left off, going crazy in the receiving game. And even though Ronaldo was wide open on this play right here, Tyler Van Dyke would find the receiver for the go-ahead touchdown in the third quarter. In a very close game on 3rd and 13, Miami would trust Ronaldo and he'd be able to get it done to convert this first down. But ultimately, Duke would get the ball back, and the whole game relied on the Miami defense, who would come up big with this interception. And ultimately, when it came down to it, even though Miami didn't run Ronaldo a lot, they would put it in his hands to put this game away. This touchdown would give Miami their 6th win of the season and their 3rd in a row, but they had their toughest opponent yet the following week. North Carolina was the favorite to win the ACC this season, as they just had 1 loss through 9 games. And even though Miami had some success early in the first quarter, they were getting stuffed in the second. Just before the half, North Carolina would extend their lead to 6, but Miami crawled their way back and found themselves up in the fourth quarter. Ronaldo was barely getting any type of success, and the game would ultimately come down to this 4th down. UNC wouldn't be able to get it, and Miami would convert this first down to secure the upset. And even though UNC was the toughest opponent they played this year, this was going to be their toughest game against Virginia Tech in the snow. This definitely wasn't the type of weather that Miami was used to, but Ronaldo and the rest of the offense would take advantage when they had their opportunities. The defense was slipping and sliding around. You would have thought it was a water park, but Miami had still yet to put any points up on the board in the first quarter, and they were down by 6 in the second. But it wouldn't last that way for long, because after Miami's first touchdown, the onslaught would start. Virginia Tech's offense wasn't able to get going, but Ronaldo was. And he had probably the best and most explosive play of his career here. And even though it looked like Miami was going to beat Virginia Tech, they needed some help from some other teams in order to get to the ACC championship. They beat North Carolina in the head-to-head, but they needed North Carolina to lose again this week. UNC would lose later that day, and Miami was going to be playing for a chance to go to the Orange Bowl. This was one of the wildest conference championship games in recent memory. Miami and Wake Forest already played earlier this season, where Wake Forest won 28-14, but that was before Miami ripped off 5 straight wins to get to this ACC championship. Wake Forest was probably the better team, but Miami had the better weapon in Ronaldo. But unfortunately, Tyler Van Dyke would get hurt on this run play, but it didn't look too serious, and his backup Jake Garcia would have to come in, and he would throw a strike in his very first play in, giving Miami the lead. Tyler Van Dyke tried to come back in the game, but was in just too much pain, would have to come back out. This field goal would extend the lead to 10, but by the second half, it was just a 1 touchdown game. Miami needed to rely on Ronaldo even more heavily now that Tyler Van Dyke was out, but on 3rd and 9, Miami would trust Garcia to try and get the first down, but he just didn't have enough to get there. Wake Forest needed a touchdown to send this game to overtime, but after trying to find his receiver in the end zone, he would get intercepted to end the game. Jake Garcia would end up being the hero. Even though he didn't play necessarily incredibly, he did just enough to get Miami this win and send them to the Orange Bowl. And Miami found out that they would be playing one of the most talented teams in college football. This was the biggest game of bowl season that wasn't the national championship. But we need to rewind to right before this game. My dog Ronaldo took some performance enhancing drugs just before this one. His speed got up to 98. It didn't seem to matter for the best damn band in the land in Ohio State, as they were up 10-0 after one, and the Ohio State defense was laying the wood on Ronaldo. Super pause. But just before halftime, Miami was finally getting a little something going, and they were in Ohio State territory. And this tunnel screen to Restrepo would go the distance, cutting Ohio State's lead. Miami would force a 3-and-out, and they would have another opportunity to score. This time, Ronaldo would be the one getting it in. And just like that, Miami took the lead against Ohio State in the Orange Bowl, but Kyle McCord was trying to put Ohio State back in this one. This interception wasn't it, but Ohio State's defense made an incredible goal line stand, forcing Miami to kick the field goal, and by the fourth quarter, we were all tied up. Ronaldo would get them into the red zone, but when they got to the goal line, they took him out and ran the read option. Tyler Van Dyke would keep it for the touchdown, and then it all came down to the Miami defense that would make this huge interception to end the game. And after starting the season out 3-4, Ronaldo was considering transferring, but after putting together 7 straight wins and an Orange Bowl victory against one of the most talented teams in college football, he knew that this team could be special.